Hi everyone, I'm Siobhan Milner and this is Total Performance, a podcast dedicated to all things athletic performance and injury prevention. Join me and my guests as we explore the many aspects that come together to build our total performance picture. Let's get into it. My guest today is Kurt Michael Downs. Kurt is an award-winning teacher with the Windsor Essex Catholic District School Board and president and head coach of the Border City Athletics Club. Kurt has represented Canada as a staff coach at 9 international events, including the Tokyo 2021 Olympic Games. He coached Canadian Olympian Brandon McBride to the 800-meter record. He guided Kelsey Balkwill to a top 6 placing in the 400 hurdles at the World Junior Championships and a top 20 placing at the World Indoor Champions in the 400 meter. He is an advocate for community and sport access for youth, having facilitated, led and created discussions, forums and programs for youth and diversity. He is a public speaker and builder, and he was also the recipient of the Canadian Running Magazine Golden Shoe Award as the Community Builder of the Year, the Under Armour Diversity Award, the Athletics Canada Dr. Doug Clement Coach of the Year, and the Contributions to Catholic Education Award. Kurt has also recently begun his PhD in kinesiology. I really enjoyed this discussion with Kurt, and I felt like I learned a lot, but not only that, was Kurt very generous with all of his knowledge. So we spoke a lot about how track and field style training can be used for non-track and field athletes, and we also talked about speed and agility in general, mechanics of running in general. Kurt gave a lot of practical examples, and I found this a super valuable listen. I hope you enjoy. Welcome, Kurt. Good morning.
Morning, Siobhan. How are you?
I am great, and I'm actually particularly excited to talk to you because I've just done some sprint training with some athletes this morning, and I had this kind of idea of questions I wanted to ask you, and then lots of things come up when you're actually out there doing things with athletes. So I'm looking forward to this.
Good.
Nice. I wanted to, so you've just mentioned to me before we started recording that you're actually also now a PhD candidate. So I'd love to know a little bit about where you think that might go.
Yeah, I just recently started in September. I had gone back to school to do a master's in 2011. And it was kind of spurred on by working with a group of athletes that I was with at the time and some of the success that we had had. And I had a lot of questions and thoughts. And at the time, there weren't that many coaches that were willing to give me, their time. Canada has been one of those places that's been sort of a double-edged sword where there's a few groups of coaches that were willing to talk and a few that were like, sort of hoarding information and didn't really want to provide information. So I had gone back and worked with Vicky Crowley at the University of Western Ontario. And she's worked with a ton of athletes, Jessica Zelinka at a point in time, as well as more recently Caroline Earhart, and she's the head coach of the Western University track and field team. So it was interesting because I also got to work with a female head coach. From there, obviously I'd gone on and worked with a bunch of different athletes, different sort of avenues and venues. And then after 2018, 19, and through COVID, I started to think maybe, I should go back to school. And it's some conversations I'd had with my father prior to his passing. And it was something that was maybe on the docket, but I wasn't really sure. And then I kind of, through the 2022 year in Oregon, I thought, hey, this is really what I want to do. I definitely want to go back and, sort of see where I can go with it and explore some thoughts and some ideas I've had. So right now, I just finished statistics and the first half of a seminar course, and it went well. And, right now I'm just thinking about possibly writing an abstract and, playing around with some thoughts on athlete development is one of them. And yeah, obviously you're in that field of athlete development. So I'm just looking at sort of possibly doing maybe a meta-analysis or analysis of and a longitudinal study of some track and field athletes here in the Windsor Essex area. I think we might be able to have access to some open source data that's already on the internet of all of the high school athletes here in the city. And then there's also possible access to some elementary school data. And then there's open source data for the university athletes as well.
So obviously you're working with track and field athletes. And I think it's one of the reasons I wanted to speak to you is there's a lot that I see for non-track and field sport. We're trying to use elements of track training to improve the performance of non-track and field athletes as well. So actually the first question I have is maybe kind of simple, but I think it's worth going over. Is maybe it's good to kind of break down what is track and field, but also what is sprint training and what is it not, because sprint training is often one of the things that we're taking with other sports.
Yeah. Well, I think obviously track and field is in the larger scheme of the world, we call it athletics. And I think it's the basis for the majority of sport. One of the reasons I was really interested in possibly working with Dr. Kevin Milne and looking at looking at athletics specifically, not just because I'm partial to it, but because it's one of the most largely populated sports in the world. Meaning, and it's also one of the easiest to have access to. You don't need a lot to be involved as far as implements, et cetera, to be involved with sport in general. Obviously, at the higher end, there's the super shoes and super spikes and all of these things that we have access to, and biomechanical analysis, et cetera. There's all those things, but at the grassroots level, being involved in athletics is, fairly easy, and it's fairly easy to have access to it. So when you think about what athletics is, I mean, it's running, jumping, throwing, essentially, and it's done through, coordination of limbs. So when you look at that and it being applicable to, volleyball or football, soccer, baseball, cricket, all of these other sports, there's a basis for it. In addition to that, almost all sports have locomotion in it. So there's some starting and stopping, moving, trying to get from point A to B as quickly as possible, accelerating limbs, all of those different components. There's so much of it involved in all sports. So again, the basis of it is usually athletics. So for me, when I think about athletics, I think of just movement patterns, locomotion, starting, stopping, jumping, throwing, accelerating implements. All of those things together is usually what comes to mind when I think of track and field or athletics. And as far as the second part of the question, thinking about, how track and field, so to speak, or athletics is applicable to other sports, I think some of it is what I just mentioned. If you're looking at volleyball, essentially you're moving laterally, and then you're moving, into a vertical component, or you're moving in a linear space and then moving to a vertical component. That's no different than, let's say, long jump. On Wednesday, I was coaching long jump, and that's essentially what we're doing. We're moving from a horizontal sort of plane to a vertical plane in space. And that's essentially what you're doing in coaching volleyball. Obviously, the dynamics of it are a little bit different, but in theory, it's the same. So I'd say that track and field, is absolutely applicable to every sport. I was having a discussion with a few coaches in a chat group that we have with some coaches from Duke, Virginia Tech, I think Chris at Eastern Michigan, and as well as Tony over at New Mexico. And in the group, one of the things we often just throw ideas out in that chat group. And, it makes sense to me when we say that, if you're doing shot put heaves, essentially you're accelerating an implement. It's no different than accelerating a racket in tennis. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also really interesting when you explain it like this, that all of these sorts of movements are in all sorts of sports, even if it looks totally different, because I think especially for a nice foundation in sport, a physical foundation, we want to be training lots of different movements. We need to move well, because one of the reasons I kind of ask this is, I work with some sports that are not on solid ground. I work with some ice sports where technically they're not running. And I also work with sports in the sand. And so I've sometimes, when I've introduced certain sprint training or certain plyometrics, I've had coaches going, oh, how is this relevant to us? Because we're actually skating, we're not running, or we're sliding, so yeah, do you feel that with different surfaces or with movements that might not be actually running, do you think that these still have benefit for those sports?
Yeah, I definitely think that there's a degree of transferability from one sport to the next at all points in time. As an example, we often work with hockey players. And I always try to explain to them, okay, hockey is a start-stop sport, right? You're moving from, essentially changing direction, and then you have to overcome inertia again and move. Stop, overcome inertia, move again, right? So in acceleration, that's essentially what you're doing anyway, right? You're going from a stop position to a start position and up tall running. Yes, there's a little bit of a lateral component in skating, same as speed skating. There is a little bit of a lateral component because of how you have to push into the ice.
Yeah.
But you're still going from a stop to a start, and continuing on from a shorter push pattern to a longer push pattern. So I still think that there's transferability in it, and you still have to essentially do it as efficiently as possible. Those are still things that we do in athletics. So I always think that there's a way to do it. I think that it's important. I think that oftentimes sports get caught up in only moving in their planes that they do as well. And sometimes stepping outside of that, there's benefit for those athletes as well, especially along the developmental pathway. I mean, in track and field, one of the things that we often do is we're so linear that we don't do, a lot of lateral movements. So as coaches, we often try to find ways to put lateral movements in, whether it's counter jump types of activities, or maybe we put them and mix them into parts of the warm up or general strength or circuits, etc. We often have to put those things in there because we're so linear. So yeah, I absolutely think that there's opportunities to do that, and it's something that's good.
I also find planning in that movement variability, so doing things that they're not doing in their sport, that has been huge. I've noticed for the athletes I work with, but actually for myself in my own training, it just makes my body feel so much better to not have like that training monotony, like it's exactly the same all the time.
It's interesting. Again, I had this conversation. There's a strength conditioning coach that we work with a little bit. He was here in our city. He's at the University of Guelph now. His name is Tommy Gingras. Good contact for you to have. Very good thinker. And we were talking a little bit about just this movement variability. And we talk about putting together sort of menu items for athletes and allowing them to be able to choose from them. And just in that, with that sort of movement variability, saying, okay, well, here are linear exercises, here are, counter movement jumps. Here would be, let's say, whatever. Having that sort of menu of items for the athlete to choose from allows them to have a little bit of ownership over the activities, but also gives them a little bit of the variability where they feel like, hey, I'm not doing the same circuit all of the time. Especially for maybe that emerging elite athlete, not necessarily the developing athlete, but more so for that emerging elite athlete where it's like, okay, I've done that, coach, I want to try a little bit something different, sort of thing. Or
Yeah,
maybe the elite athlete, right, as well.
I think that's great also just to have, some agency over their own training. Because I think the thing with elite athletes is, in a sense, I think it makes it a lot easier for them when they are told, like, this is what you have to do, because there's so many things they have to think about. So it's great to be like, okay, I don't have to think about it, I just do it. But at the same time, that in and of itself, like, no one can maintain that level of focus all the time when it's the exact same thing. So I think that's great for letting them kind of go, okay, now I'm going to do what I want to do for a bit.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And, we have sort of an acceleration complex, and I normally put 4 different types of ways to push in there. So, a skip and start or a falling start, a running start type of activity, a 2-point or a 3 or 4 point type start, ways to push. And what I always say is do 2 of the ones you like, and then choose 2 that you are not supremely fond of. Right? So they get to do 2 that they like, but they also have to do, 2 of ones that they aren't supremely fond of, because that means that those are ones that they don't feel supremely confident in.
Yeah.
They're at least touching on those components as well. So, you 2 sets of 4 accelerations to, let's say, 20 meters or 20 meters, 30 meters. I'll say, okay, we have 4 and 4. You choose 2 that you like. You choose two that you like in the second set, and then that means there's at least four total that are going to be a little bit different. So, again, they have that agency, as you said, over what they're doing.
Nice.
Yeah.
So one of the things I'm wondering, because again, I'm always thinking about I actually at the moment don't coach any sports on solid ground. Like I'm only working as an S&C coach with ice sports and sand. But of course, there's also things like swimming too. So what I'm wondering is for coaches, but also athletes, if they want to incorporate any track and field style training or any plyometrics, any sprints, any accelerations, but on solid ground. So if they're looking at running, for example, or plyometrics, is there anything that maybe first question, are there any athletes that shouldn't go straight into the high intensity plyometrics or sprints? Like, is there anything we need to bridge for those athletes that are maybe not actually running in their sports?
Again, I wouldn't say that there's something that we have to bridge, but I would say that you'd have to start it incrementally. Coach Boo always talks about having athletes do high intensity exercises, but with parameters. So, an athlete returning from an ACL injury, do they have to do high intensity activities? Yes, in moderation. That may only be something that's an impulse that's this big for right now. That turns into an impulse that might be that big. Then it might turn into something that's that big. But this is still a high intensity activity, but with parameters. So I would say when, like, we have a kid, Seba, who's just recently returned from MLS Next, and he returned to us and he just started getting back into training. And, he's 12th grade right now, so 17-ish years old. But his training program is very robust from the soccer standpoint, the football standpoint. So what we try to do is find, 1 or 2 days a week that we can do things. Oftentimes we don't go past 30 meters for him because he gets so much of his conditioning and his strength and conditioning and all the other stuff from soccer. So what we work on a lot of the time is first step, being reactive, transitioning, items like that. And what we may do, for instance, this week, we did some 1-step, 3-step, 5-step, 7-step type stuff. So high intensity, but in shorter durations and just, sort of with parameters around them, because he came in and he said, we started back training and we did something like a 4-hour session. And I looked at him and I was like, huh? I said, okay, so today you're doing recovery types of modalities, and the second session of the week we're not gonna go past 20 meters.
Okay.
And this is essentially what we did. So we did a bunch of 1-step pushes, 3-step pushes, odd numbers up to 9 steps, and that was all we did. So I think that, to answer your question, for any of the athletes, whether it's beach volleyball, swimming, any of those things, I think that there's always something you can teach from an acceleration standpoint for them, because they're always having to accelerate their body. Beach volleyball is still going to go from a standstill, accelerate to the net, and then have to gather and hit. They're going to have to do that. A 1-step type of activity is still important and relatable and for them. So yeah, the only thing I would do is maybe not only start from a linear front on type of activity or way. We might do some varied ones. They may be from the side or from a lateral type of standpoint, where maybe they start this way and then they move to being in that plane, straightforward plane as well. But I would just vary it. And that's what I would do. But I think that, sort of to sum up your question, I definitely think that it's variable. It's important for them to do. I just think maybe you have to vary it and keep the parameters on it.
You were talking about on the first step with this athlete. I kind of had two thoughts come from this. I think, like you're saying, this dosage, making sure the volume's not too high. I feel like often sports scientists understand this, people working in your field, like in track and field, understand this, strength and conditioning coaches usually understand this, but sometimes the athletes and the sports coaches don't understand quality over quantity.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you 110%. Often hockey, football, and soccer, I'd probably say are the biggest perpetrators in that area that I've dealt with more recently. I had some football players getting ready for a combine last year, some CFL athletes, and one also coming off of an injury. And he was a track athlete, so he really understands and gets it that if he's had 2 sessions in the day and he comes to track, I'm probably going to work on something technical with him. It may be dribbles, it may be, sort of truncated runs, things like along those natures of shorter duration with him, just because I know that he's done 2 sessions, maybe one in the weight room and one on the field. I'm not gonna, we're not gonna sort of, bleed everything that he's done out of his body. We don't want to do that. So he gets it. But a lot of the other guys that come over, it's very hard to get them to sort of shift that mindset and have them understand that, hey, listen, we're going to start with just these drills and things, and that's it, because you did max lifting this morning. You have a second session later on in the day. And then you have 2-a-days for the next, 2 weeks. And this is the block of time that your coach said that you need to come and do sprint training. Okay, so we're going to do these things so that you're able to also, function and function well with the other parts of your training. And maybe, we'll talk to your coach about switching days so that we can pair some of the themes with what they're doing. I think that's also something that applies to those coaches or the athletes, is that they don't always know how to pair themes. And I know Coach Boo talks about this quite often, is, pairing similar themes. Like if you're doing, speed power types of activities, then we should be doing speed power types of activities on the track as well. Don't go and do your endurance work and then come and do, essentially all of your speed power work right after. Those themes don't pair, they don't match. So I think that oftentimes that, when coaches are stepping maybe outside of their comfort level and asking for some help with acceleration or developing, speed development and those types of themes and qualities, they don't often realize that they may have to, shuffle a little bit their training because they're often, not very fluid in those thought processes.
Sure. One of the other things you said that kind of piqued my interest was about accelerations from a stopped position, because this is pretty relevant to the sports I'm with. Like, as you mentioned, with volleyball, we see this a lot, but short track, especially in the 500 meters, short track speed skating, it is amazing that first acceleration to try and get into position around the corner. It is amazing how it really feels with the 500 meters that 90% of the time, whoever gets in front there first is going to win the race. So that acceleration is super important. But I wondered, for athletes, but also as coaches, is there something we should consider for training that kind of acceleration from a stop compared to accelerating when we're already moving?
Like I said, I would look at sort of activities where they're first burst types of activities. I'm sure things that you already, force plates, things like that. I'm sure you have access and use those types of modalities. I always like standing long jumps and things to that nature. Anything that are bursts where the athlete has to be coordinated. I would even look at, I don't know if you do standing long, standing triples, exercises like that, where they have to start from a position, gather and coordinate themselves, and then get into move, and then obviously sustain those movements for a duration. I think that's important. The one thing with speed skating is biomechanically it's a little bit different than an acceleration for like track and field, because obviously those strides are much shorter, just based on the skate and the foot being locked in, even
And
though I
they're
know
also so low the whole time compared to, well, actually in the first acceleration, they're upright, but still they have to get low pretty fast.
so, because of those things, I think that obviously there's those considerations, but I think from trainability standpoint of like biomotor qualities, I think that standing long jumps, standing triple would be important, measuring like counter jump movements, would be important. I would say, I still think the first, second, and third step type of activities are still good. I think with those types of things, I would look at maybe contrast training is another thing that we often talk about, possibly doing it resisted.
Mhm.
For the first part, a 7 stride pattern. I would look, if it was me, I would look at how many strides does it take to get to the first turn for that athlete. And then I would try to obviously train that into the qualities that I was working with acceleration. And I would say, okay, and I don't know this with speed skating, but I would say maybe it's 13 strides to the first turn.
Mhm.
I would say, okay, then I would look at 13 strides and I would say, and I would start to plan out, 1, 3, 5, 7, et cetera, on the way down. And I would say, let's go resisted for the first one, the first three, the first five. Let's go 1, 3, 5 on its own. Then let's go 1, 3, 5 assisted.
Mhm.
And I mean, if you had access to a 1080 or a run rocket or those sorts of things, maybe I would sort of implement those sorts of modalities in as well. I mean, I'm sure you could do it just with resistance bands or something along those lines, but I would, possibly work in those capacities and in those spaces and see how the athlete felt, and then obviously come back and time them. Without knowing speed skating that well, that's sort of, my initial thought
Mhm.
is what I might look at doing. Again, obviously, there's lots of things you can train in the weight room that, have potential transferability with those skills as well. But off the top of my head, that's what I would think for sure.
I'm really happy with how generous you are with all your information as well, Kurt, because I feel like I'm learning a lot. So I just wanted to say that.
I'd say thank you, but I would say I'm super fortunate. I've had lots of people, give time to me.
Mm.
Friends, that have spent time on phone calls or emails, text messages, whatever. And sometimes I'm maybe a little bit of a pain because I keep emailing and texting, as and it's not meant in any disrespectful way. It's just that I think that maybe they're really good at something, they have an
Mm.
idea, or they maybe worked with an athlete that has had an issue or something that they're working through.
Mm.
And so whenever people call, I try my very best to provide as much information as possible.
You talked about resisted training. Now, I'm really curious about this because I haven't really looked into the science around this for years now. I know when I did my bachelor's, so I don't know, it was like 13 years ago, we were cautioned with resisted training that if the resistance was too high or you did too much of it, you might actually see people slow down. Is there anything we need to think of or be careful of for resisted training?
Know that there's some research out there, and actually there's another chat group I'm in with some Canadian coaches here, one at Guelph, one at Saskatchewan, Alberta, Toronto, and I can't remember where the other one is now. But the like really good think tank. I remember a few years ago, maybe it was 2017, we started to talk about. I think it was Stu McMillan and Dan had posted or put out a paper or two on resisted training, and it talked about 5%, 5 to 10% of the athlete's body weight.
Mhm.
And then recently I've talked to some other coaches and they've said that they don't usually subscribe to the 5 or 10% rule.
Mm.
They do is they just try to keep the unloading of the weight consistent.
Mhm.
So one of the things that I've done this year is with the kids I have, I've gone, for instance, 10 pounds on the sled, 5 pounds unload,
Yeah.
and just tried to keep that, the unloading pattern consistent because there's so many of them.
Mhm.
Where in the past, when I was still at the University of Windsor and I was coaching, hurdles and sprints there, I really tried to dial it in and be very, specific on, that 5 to 10% of the body weight. I know there are people that will go as high as 15 or 20% of the body weight. And use some heavier sleds with the resistance, or even with the 1080i. But again, even with that, I know it's for a period of time, like let's say one cycle. So maybe it's 3 weeks where they'll do one session a week for 3 weeks and then unload the heavier sleds or resisted runs. So I would say whenever you set up your patterns, I would just say make sure the consistency of the unloading is important. And again, I would also, I mean, depending on what technology you have, if you do have like a 1080i, you can also track so many other metrics where it give you information on whether or not, body position, ground contacts, etc., are being compromised because of the amount of resistance that's being applied. But for me, I don't have access to those. So I try to stay somewhere on the lesser end of it and, just try to keep my unloading patterns, as consistent as possible.
Mhm.
Uh, Obviously, there's some of the younger developing athletes where we may only use resisted bands, and those are often held by other athletes, and what I try to do is I try to pair the athletes with someone of the same height, weight, etc. as them so that obviously, when I'm not having someone that's, overpowering, one of the athletes. But that's often, again, what I do here.
You mentioned body position and whether or not that's affected. What I'm curious about when it comes to, I think, particularly thinking of running and sprinting, when athletes who are not track and field athletes, when they come and do some of this track style training or accelerations or sprints, in Olympic weightlifting, like there's talk of fixed versus variable components of technique. So, like, this is the technique that ideally we're going to see in 90% of lifts, and this is the technique that is maybe a little murky and depends on limb lengths, like all of these sorts of things. So is there anything that athletes should really, really focus on when it comes to sprint training in terms of technique, and are there other things that they can kind of get away with?
I think we always coach to the standard.
Mhm.
We're always looking at things like torso angles, angle at the hip, shin angles are probably one of the most important. You'll obviously hear terms like being dorsiflexed and how you contact the ground.
Mhm.
Again, if there's sports like, for instance, you're dealing with, I'm not as concerned with up tall running or maximum velocity running, because in their sports, the majority of them aren't going to get there. Like I used to have this conversation with there was a baseball player we worked with who played in the Detroit Tigers organization, Jacob Robson, and I would always talk to him, and his strength and conditioning coach at the time was at Mississippi State. I believe he's at Virginia Tech now as well. And we'd always talk about the fact that stealing bases for him and the test, he had a 60-yard test, I believe, that he had to run. And I'd always say, okay, let's think about the needs for, or the KPIs, the needs that he has for his, like for sprinting in his sport. And I would say, okay, well, this is the distance between the bases, 30 yards or 20 yards or, 40 yards. The distance is not that substantial. By the time that he gets, remotely tall, he's already starting to descend and get into a position where he's going to slide. So is complete upright mechanics and everything else that we're focusing on for him, is it super, super important? Or is just accelerating to 20 meters for him the most important thing? So I think when we look at what the task is or sort of what the responsibility is for the athlete to do for that event or that sport, I say let's look at the mechanics that are necessary for that, and let's stay mostly in that wheelhouse. And yeah, we'll do a little bit of this, but if we're, sort of splitting up, the quantities of what we're going to do, we're probably going to spend the majority of what we do in preparing that athlete in these areas here. So him, we would spend a lot of time, to 20 meters and, maybe get to 30. And that would really be the extent of what we did for him. So when we look at positions, I would say, are his positions going to be perfect? No, because he's not coming essentially 100% from, a 4-point position. So are we going to do a stand start with him? Absolutely, we're going to do a stand start for him. Are we going to look at a stand start linear? No, because very often he's not going to be in a linear position straight ahead. He's probably going to be in this position. So what I'm going to look at is I'm going to look at him from a sideways stance, and then I'm going to look at him essentially being able to move from this position, turn, and then accelerate. And a lot of the positions are similar, Shin angles are similar. Torso angles are similar after he's swung or, after he's skipped into that acceleration position from, let's say first base. A lot of the positions are similar, but I'd say, we'd look at just a couple. Shin angle, torso angle, and then how the foot is contacting the ground. Maybe just those three with those types of athletes. And I'd probably say not ignore the other ones. I don't want to say ignore the other ones, but I would say that, again, when you're getting these athletes, I may have them twice a week, maybe once a week. And I may only have them for 45 minutes, an hour, in some cases, an hour and a half, which is fantastic. But in a lot of cases, I only have, this amount of time. So I would just focus on those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I work with some athletes who in pre-season or off-season will go to track and field coaches. So this is also one of the things I'm thinking about for them because, as I say, none of my sports are kind of traditional running sports. So in terms of technique for them, is there anything with injury risk that they should keep in mind? You mentioned like the ground contact, and I know for me when I'm teaching certain plyometric progressions, I'm trying to make sure that they are not plant effects, like not pointing their toes a lot so they don't land like this. But yeah, any general tips for if they're going into track and field training?
Um, and you may laugh at this, but I think the very first one of them is making sure that they have appropriate footwear.
Mm.
Over the course of the last 10 years of working with the football and, soccer athletes, and especially the hockey athletes, they will come to you with shoes that they've worn, even actually the basketball athletes as well. They'll come to you with the most improper wear selections that I've ever seen in my life. I've seen them come with CrossFit shoes that the soles are so rigid that they can't, like it's the equivalent of them coming with, weightlifting shoe and attempting to sprint. And then wondering why, after their warm up, their feet are, fried. Um, so I'd say the biggest sort of tip I would say is make sure they're coming with proper footwear right off the bat. I'm not saying you have to go out and buy brand new shoes, but don't come with shoes that were 10 years old or are something that's just not conducive to sprinting or moving quickly. The second thing I'd say is as far as ground contacts, I said, yes, always coach and teach ground contact. I always find trying to dispel the myth of being plantar flexed is so it's such a hard thing. And I feel like it's very much still, a virus or an epidemic in coaching, and I'm always trying to show like, I had one of the kids come last year and she always has shin sleeves on up to her knees and, all these things. And I keep pulling out video and trying to explain to her, I'm like, I understand what your high school coach is telling you, but here is the video that's suggesting that this is how very elite performers contact the ground. I'm like, this is a kinegram. This is showing you where they're contacting the ground at all points, both sides. This is what's happening. This is the standard for the most elite athletes in the event that you want to compete in. So either I'm insane or like something isn't, correct here. So I think that we need to evaluate what and how you need to contact the ground. I'd say the same for some of these other sports, is when they come to you, obviously, evaluate how they're contacting the ground, but be cognizant of the fact that when they go back to their other sport or their other coaches, oftentimes the message is not the same. The messaging isn't paired. So I'd say just be cognizant of that and be armed and ready to show as many examples as possible of the most elite performers and how they contact the ground, sometimes across all sports. I had a rugby player once. He's a South African rugby player, big guy. I think he was one of the number one players in the world. And I was trying to show this athlete how he was contacting the ground. And I was like, do you see what I mean? He has to apply force. I'm like, if he doesn't apply force in midfoot, what's going to end up happening is he's probably going to break his foot because look at the size of him, so those sorts of themes I would say are important in sort of teaching, coaching, or giving tips on when those other athletes come to work with you or even any of the other strength and conditioning coaches.
Yeah, the application of force, that's a big one because I've seen as well, you know, I've worked in the past in personal training and commercial gyms as well. And I remember when I was working in a commercial gym, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I came in one day, we did some hit style class, and there was all of a sudden, all of these people kind of running like they were lifting their knees. They weren't
Yeah.
applying force, they were lifting their knees. And someone had told them, yeah, you've got to get your knees high. And without realizing that when you apply the force, of course, you're going to come off. And that's actually what gets the knee lift. It's not trying to get them off the ground like a horse.
Well, and this is the toughest thing because I think that what ends up happening often is that years ago, everyone say, "Oh, run on your toes, run on your toes, run on
Yeah.
your toes." And I think that what people fail to realize is just that is that you do have to apply force. A change of direction for a non-athletic sport athlete, like if you say that to run on your toes to a beach volleyball player, it's a recipe for disaster. You know what I mean? If they're on the on the sand and they're trying to move across the sand and they're running on their toes, they're applying no force, which means there's no change of direction.
Mm-hmm.
And because you have to apply force in the opposite direction that you're going in order to go in that direction. They're just, it's counterintuitive, but again, I don't know.
Yeah. I find this fascinating because so my background is like as a athlete myself is in endurance. So, but when I was about 17 or 18 saw a sports doctor. This was when there was kind of the gluteus medius craze, which I think has never really died off, but also like a whole lot
Get
of stuff
stuff.
around forefoot running. And
Yeah.
he said to me, I had medial tibial stress syndrome, and he said, you've got to switch to forefoot. So I actually tried forefoot running for years, and now I've gone back to, I was a heel striker. I'm now a midfoot stance, and I'm very happy in the midfoot. But yeah, this is why I find this also fascinating as well, because I kind of have tried all of them and felt all of them. And what I notice is when I really ran for a while and tried this, I couldn't get rhythm. That was how I found, like, because I just
Yeah.
couldn't push out of the ground properly.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Dan always says that, or sorry, I think it's Boo would always talk about a few things in presentations he would give, and he would always say that foot contact is speed determinant. It's a determinant of how
Yeah.
fast. So, essentially, if you're walking, you're going to be a heel striker, and the vast majority of people when they're walking are. As you move to a jog, you're going to be a midfoot, right? And with the ultra running and et cetera, the pace that you probably would be going at would be, jog a little bit faster
It's
because
not a
it's
sprint for sure.
the duration of time. And then when you move to sprints, yes, you're more a foot to,
Mm,
forefoot, but it's still contacting, you're still coaching contacting here.
mm,
Then obviously you're gonna move to midfoot at sort of takeoff,
mm,
or sorry, to forefoot at takeoff.
mm.
So obviously it's dependent on your speed, and I'm a very big believer that I mean again when you look at so many of these kinograms or look at slides of athletes running the elite performing ones, that's essentially what you see. So that's what you coach to the standard of. So yeah, I agree 100% wholeheartedly with what you're saying.
Mhm, mhm. I find for me the only real difference is when I'm mountain running, then I am in this like more forefoot position, and that's just kind of almost an
Yeah.
isometric going up the hill.
And again, that's determinant on the terrain that you're running on as well, right? I mean, I know in a lot of different facilities they have essentially ramps, etc., for this reason. And it's very hard to be completely flat-footed when you're on an incline,
Mhm.
right?
Cool.
Yeah. Mountain running, that's interesting.
I love it. And that's the one really hard thing about living in the Netherlands. I don't know if you know this, the Netherlands is super, super flat. When I run, if I go for like a 10K or something, I make 3 meters elevation gain here. So I have to travel for my mountains now.
At some point, I'll get there. I've been to the Netherlands, but I haven't been to the center. And I keep saying I'm coming back at some point. I tried for years to get our coaches here
Mm.
to do one of the training camps there.
Oh, yeah.
There's everything there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
You guys have everything,
yeah.
you know. So,
Nice.
yeah, it does look like an incredible facility and place to be and train.
Yeah, we're very lucky with our facilities. But I'm originally from New Zealand, so then I grew up around mountains. So when I go home, I get all the mountains in that I can.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I had a Kiwi here with us for a little while.
Oh, cool.
We went to the University of Texas,
Okay.
uh, and he was here training and staying with us for a while.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's another place on my bucket list, by the way.
You have to
Like,
go. It's beautiful.
yeah, I don't know when, but that's on my bucket list.
Cool. Is there anything else that you feel like you would like to tell people?
Um, I think coaching is incredible. I think it's one of the best passions, jobs, hobbies in the world. You get to be involved with young people. You get to be involved in athletics. You get to meet great people and have wonderful conversations. I think that anybody would want to be involved with it, if they were able to just immerse in it for a little bit. The only other thing I would say is do just that. Immerse yourself in it and learn everything you can and set up think tanks.
Mm.
Years ago, I was listening to Gary Winkler talk, and he talked about these groups that he used to set up, with a bunch of elite coaches. And there are a bunch of head coaches or assistant coaches in the NCAA. And what they would do is at every meet or cross country meet, they would get together and throw things up on a whiteboard.
Mm.
Talk about their training programs and be kind of scrupulous with it and not attack each other, but make sure that they defended their thought process. And I'll say that the best years of coaching that I've ever had, maybe even how minimal they've been, have been because I've humbled myself and I've asked questions.
Mm.
I've been, not afraid to talk to people and to throw things up on a board and get it torn up and then, have to explain it. It doesn't matter how good you get or how good you think you are.
Mm.
Always opportunities to learn, and there's always opportunities to go back and reinvent yourself. That would pretty much be my advice to young coaches or strength and conditioning coaches or maybe even athletes.
I love that. Kurt, where can people find you if they want to know more about you or if they want to work with you?
Me, pretty easy to get a hold of on Twitter, Instagram, or sorry, not Twitter, X. On all those, I'm just Coach Kurt Michael D. On LinkedIn, I think I'm just Kurt Michael Downs. I'm pretty easy to get a hold of. Just fire me a message, and it may take a little bit to get back, but yeah.
You're a busy man.
Currently, right now, yes, but yeah, always will try to find time for anyone that I can.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you finding time for this. So thank you so much.
No, like I said, excited to come on and get a chance to talk to you. And then obviously, like I said, anything else, please just drop me a line.
Thank
And
you.
I will definitely try to get out to the Netherlands at some point.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Just a reminder that you can find further podcast episodes at www.siobhan-milner.com/podcast. And this is where you can also find different ways of working with me if you head to www.siobhan-milner.com. Enjoy!